Okay, I'm going to run my program shortly to make sure all of these things work. It's not going to do a great deal, it's just going to find some information and print it on the screen. But before I go there is one or two things that I've got to put right in my program, otherwise I'll be experiencing a crash. First thing is that I've used here sys.exit from the system files to actually stop the program gracefully, but I haven't imported that, so I'm going to import that. Oops, so that I don't receive an error message when I run it. And the second thing, I've been a bit crafty. Let me explain what's happening. Every time I run the program and it makes a call to my bound inbox or anything from the transport API, it costs me a hit. We can see that here, how much it costs you. So to call this once, it cost me 1 hit. And I may be calling this several times when I've got my program, checking it out, and you are only allowed so many hits on a free account, and you're allowed about 1,000 hits per day. Now that might seem quite a lot. How am I going to call this 1,000 times? But actually it isn't a lot when you're building and testing your program, or when somebody else is using your program. You need 1,000 users and you've got 1 hit per day. So I am trying to keep the hit rate down by not testing at every stage, but I will test at certain points just to make sure everything's running as it should do, just to keep the hits down. You could test it all the time. You probably won't hit 1,000. You might hit around about 800 while you build the program, just testing it out and running it at every stage. But I'm trying to be careful. I'm trying to keep the number of hits down. I've also created the bus bounds, to match exactly what I require for this. In other words, I'm passing in the latitude, the longitude, but I actually got those values here in geometry, so I could have used that all in one go. I'm going to choose to do that in a separate way. I'm going to have a call to this function after I've got my details from around here, because if I want to extend or expand my program, I might have this as just a function on its own, in its own library, and I really want it to match pretty much what I'm doing here, because later on I might call it with different values of latitude and longitude. I might not use the geometry that I've chosen from here. So that's the reason why I've done that. It might never happen, I don't know. It's just something that I've been doing. But I've got to join now these two things. So if I get the latitude and longitude, I now need to call this. So I need to call this function so that I can create this API and return the results here. So I'm going to have another function called def bus bounds, same thing, but the way I'm calling it is with an address. Okay, so I'm just going to use an address and then get the latitude, longitude and call them from here. So I'm going to use this to call this, which will call this eventually. So I'm going to start off the same as I did before. I'm going to set my geometry to be empty, an empty dictionary, and then I'm going to set it, because in here I'm returning geometry. I don't need to do this. If you recall from what I said on values, it can act as a global variable, so I don't really need to do this. This is just because I'm passing information and returning information that I'm performing this action. When I refactor the program, I'll probably take all of these out and just use globals. So the geometry equals the get lat lon. So I am now calling this function, and I need to pass in an address. Now at the moment it doesn't know what the address is, so I need to call this function with an address. So I'm going to be calling the earlier function, this get address, to retrieve an address. That is going to pass it into here as an address. That is then going to call this function with that very same address. And then my result is going to be this result here, returned from bus bounds. So I'm going to call bus bounds, and this time what I'm going to pass, I'm not just going to pass min lat, min long, I'm going to be passing these items in here. Okay, so these are going to be returned when I call get lat long. These are going to be set, so I'm going to use them in my call to here. Now if you notice, I started off with the minimum, maximum. I've got to put it in exactly the same order, so I'm going to choose first of all the minimum latitude. So if I copy that one and paste that into my call, and then I'm going to be using the minimum longitude. So if I copy that one and paste that one into my call, and then I'm going to use the maximum latitude. Now I'm copying and pasting just to stop me making a typing mistake. And finally the max longitude, which is that one, and pass that value in there. So now let's just stretch this a little bit so I can see. So all I'm doing is calling the lat lon, this one, to get the geometry. I've reset the geometry to empty because I don't know which function is going to be calling it at any one point, but I'm using this one. So I'm resetting it to 0, calling it, and then getting the bounds. And the last thing is, once I've got the result, I just need to return that to whatever called this. Return result. So it's a pretty unnecessary function. I could have just done it inside here and not passed anything in at all. But I actually wanted to keep this one separate because I may have further uses for it later, and pass in the values in a different way. So I'm getting ready now to actually test my program to see if it works or if it doesn't work, and then fix the little bits and pieces. So we'll have a look at that in the next video. We'll try and make some of these calls.